Thank God Riot finally nerfed Volibear. The champion was just too insane. We've all felt it. And there's plenty of other things that Riot has taken a nerfing to, and here today as we go over our tier list, we're going to try and predict how the champions are going to do on the patch in every role so that you can have a great idea of what you should be looking to abuse and avoid in your games. Please do keep in mind that this tier list is aimed at Platinum and below. And as several of you have said, you don't mind that being called low elo, so that's how I'll refer to it from now on. And I'm not trying to say anything about that other than self-awareness is a great thing to have. And another great thing to have is our website, where we can give you guys tons of guides that are all done by challenger level players on just about any topic that you could ever need to improve in League. We're always releasing more content there every single day, whether it be champion guides, lane specific guides, or anything in between on any skill. And I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret here. If you hit the like and sub buttons, you actually get a 0.1 AD bonus. And that might not sound like a lot, but it adds up over time. That's all I'm saying, you know, it's a good thing to have. All right, enough jibber jabber, and let's jump right into the tier lists, starting with the mid lane, of course. Do keep in mind that this is entirely prediction based on the patch notes that have come out. We're still using the tier list that we've created in the past to keep a rolling thing going forward, but now it might look a little different in terms of how heavily we move people around. With that, we can highlight different things and don't have to go over every tier, as it isn't necessarily something we should look at. Instead, we're going to look at what helps you guys answer your questions about the list directly. So, for example, let's talk about the broken tier and Annie versus Diana and why they're there. Both Annie and Diana have good burst damage with very respectable sustained damage. It's very easy for these champions to bully people out of lane, either because they have a way to damage people without pushing the wave, or they can simply win trades thanks to the value that's baked into their abilities. Annie has her E for damage reduction, Diana has her W for shielding. They also have low cooldowns and a form of mobility. In Annie's case, it's built into her E as well, and Diana, she can dash around with her E. And of course, they're both known for their incredible ultimates that can completely change the course of a team fight and are also just powerful in a 1v1. With all this stuff going for them, they're still pretty simple champions and not that complex. That doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of options though. One of the best ways to gauge a champion's strength is to ask yourself, what can this champion do if I get dove on? What can this champion do if I'm trying to dive onto the enemy team? And if you manage to come up with answers for questions like that as you keep going down the line of different possibilities of what they can do, then chances are they're probably very strong. By this point, I'm fairly certain that you guys are already well on your way of deciding why these champions are strong for yourself, and so I don't need to explain it anymore. And I encourage you to look at the champions that you're interested in on this list and do the same thing for them. Ask yourself questions about why they might be there. It's a really good way to improve your general game knowledge and your laning matchups because you have a better understanding of what enemies can do to you. Being able to think like your opponent is thinking is very important in League. But enough getting hung up on those two champions, let's talk about Zed since we moved him up to the S tier this patch. That's because of the buffs that he received. I'm not saying that he's guaranteed 100% to be S tier, but it's definitely looking very convincing. For those of you who have been around for a while and remember some of the buffs and nerfs that have happened to Zed in the past, one of the things that Riot specifically did because he was way too strong and easy was nerf the travel speed of Zed's W. And now they are reverting that. Speeding this up is a problem because in the past, Zed was overpowered, and this was one of the things that they took away from him. The other thing was the cooldown of the ability going up by a bit, and now they're also handing that back to him early game as well. If you're a Zed player, at this point, the right thing to do is celebrate, because today might just be your day. Let's do a quick gear shift and go all the way down into D tier. And let's talk about Akali for a second and why she's here. Let's break down together the technical reasons why a champion like Akali would be all the way down here. So first of all, Akali is definitely a difficult champion. She might not be the most difficult to play in League, but she's definitely very hard. She's got very high energy costs, which are really difficult to maintain, especially long term, and a lot of the time in your bad matchups and range disadvantage matchups, you're going to be at a significant disadvantage because you constantly have to use energy to farm effectively. Even when you do manage to actually close the distance or are up against a melee champion, you probably find yourself against somebody who has mobility or can just straight up fight you. You're up against things like the likes of Kassadin, Nocturne, Galio, Diana, Annie, all these champions have ways to deal with Akali and just completely shut her down. This rings true for many of the champions above her, and some of them don't necessarily strictly shut her down, but can help their allies shut her down. So you as the player who's trying to pilot Akali, now find yourself in a situation where you have to get ahead, otherwise it's extremely easy for one thing to go wrong and then your plan just completely collapses. And when you in the mid lane suddenly fold like a piece of paper, the enemy jungler is going to have a field day against your jungler alongside your enemy mid laner. With that, let's wrap up the mid lane, as I feel like we've definitely covered a lot, and hopefully you guys have a much better idea of what we're doing with the tier list as a whole. I'm not telling you by putting Akali in D tier that your champion sucks. That's not how the game works. Very few champions have ever sucked in the history of League of Legends. What I am saying is that if you were to pick something else other than Akali, you are almost guaranteed to have an easier time. But does that mean you're gonna have a good time? Well, I'll leave that answer to you. But what I can say for you is that you probably noticed that many times on Akali, you do struggle and the game can feel unfair. And it's almost guaranteed that that's because champions who are in the higher tiers are fighting against you and it feels like you're playing at a disadvantage. Alright, we got a lot of important information out of the way, so let's get on to the top lane tier list now and cover the rest of them with a little bit less information heavy stuff going on, alright? Broken tier in top lane, as you can see, is still Singed and Quinn. These two champions are still performing really well, and they have been for several patches now. Singed longer than Quinn. If for some reason you don't believe me, you can just go check that on pretty much any stats website of your choice. But you don't even need to do that because I can just reason through this with you. If you look at the S tier and some of the A tier when compared to Singed and Quinn, you find very few matchups that they actually have a hard time in. That's because for the most part, Singed and Quinn are two champions who don't care about what their opponents are doing. It's very easy for them to do what they want no matter what. In Quinn's case, it's very easy for her to just repeatedly harass people until they're out of lane, and if they try to stay in there, then she can just kill them and all in them with her ignite. Singed is kind of similar, where he can even get to the point where he just proxies under your tower and there's nothing you and your jungler combined can even do about it. Quinn can feel similarly as stupidly uncontrollable because she gets to a point where she hits level 6 and can permanently leave lane and gank other lanes as if she was a second jungler and be back top lane before the wave even crashes to tower. Their strengths are similar, but the way they're executed are completely different. And let's talk about Volibear now, who, as you might have noticed, has moved down to the A tier from S tier. And that's because I do actually think that given the nerfs that Riot has slated out for him, it might actually be a problem for the top lane. You see, Volibear loses a solid chunk of attack speed, and I also am apparently losing my voice-to-voice cracks. By losing base attack speed, it reduces the effectiveness of his passive attack speed bonus, which means that he is going to have worse trades. He's also going to push waves slower, and if you combine those two with the fact that there are already existing bad matchups for him, I think that that definitely has the potential to push him out of the S tier. On this change in particular, I want to know what you guys think, because I'm not 100% sure if that's actually enough to push him out of the S tier. Other than that though, this patch has been pretty stale for top lane in terms of changes, and I don't anticipate anything else really going wacky other than that. If you guys have any questions about anybody in particular, comment them below, and I can go over it the next time we update our tier list, or just in the comments with you. Here's where things start to get a little tricky though, because as we step over to the Bush Boys, things have gotten quite a bit wacky over here. Keep in mind, I am a jungle main, and things are still kind of up in the air here, because as you might notice, I put Kayn in broken tier. But the amount of champions in S tier has gone up considerably, as I have moved up Vi, Nocturne, Graves, and moved down Volibear because of his nerfs, and I've also moved up Nunu. In reality, the broken tier being Kayn is honestly just my guess, because I have no idea who is going to come out on top after Volibear is going down swinging with his nerfs. And truthfully, he might even be lower than S tier, because losing attack speed and losing sustain in the jungle is extremely bad. I don't think he would be any lower than A tier, so you don't really need to worry about him being a truly less good champion compared to most others, as he's not getting gutted that hard, and it's not like he won't be able to actually be played in the jungle. At worst, he's going to be just okay. Considering that he is relatively easy to play, it's not going to be that big of a deal for most people either. Enough about Volibear though, let's keep talking about this whole broken tier thing, because it honestly blows my mind. any of the champions in S tier other than maybe Warwick and Zac, I could see as being a broken tier pick. And honestly, I take that back. Even Zac could potentially be a broken tier pick here, because they all have ways to deal with things that the meta is throwing them right now, and they all have advantages over each other. I specifically chose Kayn here because he is the most flexible out of them all. When you're playing Kayn, in Champion Select, you can choose your runes and go accordingly to blue or red Kayn based on the enemy team composition, and that can make a very, very big difference. Red Kayn might be struggling against a team that has a bunch of knockbacks and knockups, like against an enemy who has a support Janna, for example. But blue Kayn would absolutely love that scenario because he could just eat a Janna in like 2 spells. A Zac, on the other hand, would be miserable because he would almost never be able to engage against something like a Janna. That's just one specific example, but I do think that is the idea that will have Kayn above the rest of them on this upcoming patch. We'll have to see how it plays out though. There's 3 other things I want to point out here. One of them is in the A tier. Let's talk about this Kha'Zix buff. The Kha'Zix buff is a little bit sneaky because it seems smaller than it actually is. You have to remember that isolation does also apply to monsters. This results in Kha'Zix having a faster clear, and good Kha'Zix players who know what they're doing and know how to abuse their isolation will feel it even more so. Faster clearing means healthier clearing, and healthier clearing means better fighting, and better damage in those better fights means even better fights. A lot of betters, but you get the idea. The rest of the stuff I want to mention is all about the stuff in the B tier, and specifically I'm looking at Trundle and Karthus, who are 2 people who moved down from A tier, and while we're at it, why not mention Sejuani, who is staying here despite getting a buff. Trundle got a fat attack speed hit on his W, and that is definitely something that completely cripples a champion in the jungle. Trundle already has good clears in terms of health, but his speed is where he has a question mark. And now that it's getting even worse, that's an issue. They also did nerf the movement speed recently, and so you have to compound that nerf from last patch on top of this one. Riot claims that this is mostly aimed at pro play, and I'm sure we can all understand how having a few seconds difference in a clear would really affect the pros. But you're gonna feel it too, don't get that twisted. In terms of Karthus, Riot has finally listened to the insane amount of people proposing this nerf to Karthus, where they gave him a percentage reduction of his damage on his Q to jungle monsters. While this isn't the fattest nerf to jungle Karthus, it still does affect him. If you do the math, you end up doing a decent amount of damage less per Q, and that can slow down your clear considerably, as the AoE from Talisman might not line up nicely, you might have to end up using more mana on your E, and all that sorts of other stuff. They did give him movement speed back, but movement speed doesn't make a difference as much as you might think if you're still stuck there clearing the camp for longer. Same thing applies to objectives, as this does apply to all monsters. And then that last thing that I mentioned about Sejuani, she is getting a small amount of damage on her E and a lower cooldown for being able to stun champions, but I'm not quite sure that that's going to push her enough to get her out of B tier. What made her strong in the past isn't coming back with these changes, and it's not convincing enough for me to think immediately that she'd be moving up to A tier. Will the buff make her feel better? Oh yeah, don't get me wrong, for sure. But is it going to make her feel better than the rest of the champions in B tier? Probably not. That wouldn't stop any Sejuani from ganking bot lane as soon as she gets the opportunity, because let's face it guys, killing 2 people in the bot lane is better than killing anybody in a solo lane, right? Of course that's how the game works. And while we're there, let's talk about the AD carry tier list. Specifically in the broken tier, I do think that Jhin and Kog'Maw are going to be the top of the bot lane still on this next patch. They've been doing consistently well for quite some time now, at least like 5 patches, maybe even more, and with other AD carries who have been contesting them getting nerfed or having their items nerfed, they're still going to remain at the top while the others fall down. Thanks to the current support meta, these AD carries also have a much easier time doing what they want to do. Having lanes where it's very easy to abuse long-range poke or destroy people with a heavy range advantage due to slows or other CC that you and your support have combined, it's no surprise that these 2 champions are actually doing well, even if they can be a bit more difficult than most. Jhin can feel like an uncatchable monster, especially when he gets ahead, and Kog'Maw can just press one button and melt through just about anybody. Now, he wouldn't be able to do that alone, but that's why supports are so important, and of course, the rest of your team. Even if they get in the way and just take damage for you, that's honestly an effective strategy if you're trying to protect something as powerful as a Kog'Maw. And if you still are having doubts, let me paint you a picture this way. Kog'Maw is effectively the same thing as Misfortune, but with higher range, less AoE, and more DPS. Both of them rely on good positioning, have a decent amount of burst, a way to execute people, good damage even when switching targets, but the thing is that Kog'Maw has even more DPS, while Misfortune has AoE DPS that can be countered through CC very easily. If Misfortune was one of the best AD carries in the game just a couple months ago, why wouldn't Kog'Maw be able to be one now? Sometimes the answer to who's the best doesn't necessarily come down to actually the strength of one champion, but how weak the other ones are. And in this scenario, AD carries are usually having that problem. And you could see exactly this because of the nerfs that Riot is throwing at Varus. They also nerfed him last patch, and I actually moved him down to C tier hero in this patch because they continue to nerf him, and in a way that does affect all players, even though they say specifically they're concerned about pro play. Here's the thing about Varus in bot lane. Other bot laners are too weak to be able to punish Varus enough to take advantage of the fact that he is supposed to have a somewhat weak early game. It's extremely easy to pick Varus and go lethality and just go even or fall slightly behind, or hey, maybe even get ahead of the opponent and then feel completely out of control because your Q is half healthing people on the enemy team. With lots of AD carries having the ability to get a free pass in the bot lane because they need to be affected by either mid or jungle ganks, roams, and tower dives, these champs are able to scale really well and smash people's heads open. In the case of Varus, he's taking a pretty big nerf to his other builds in order to make sure that lethality isn't strong enough. The last thing I want to highlight here is Ezreal moving down to B tier from A tier. And this is because of the increased cooldown on his E, which doesn't seem very bad because Ezreal buys a lot of cooldown reduction. You know, he's not particularly easy to kill, so he can survive for a while, and he's also, of course, very mobile. But with his E cooldown going up by 3 seconds at all ranks, if you do the math, this actually ends up being 1 to 2 more Qs needing to land before you can use it again, and that is something that is very important. If you are playing Ezreal, you now have more pressure on you to continue consistently landing your Qs, otherwise your mobility is going to get gimped. It's normally not that difficult to land 2 to 3 Qs and get out of a bad situation before somebody can collapse on top of you. Even if you happen to E forward at a really bad time and you need to land 3 or maybe even 4 in order to get it off again, that's not too big of a deal because you have extra movement speed, or you might be slowing them with something like Iceborne Gauntlet. And hey, you have stuff like Blade of the Ruined King on some builds as well. But when you're upping the amount of time he needs by 3 seconds and asking him to land 2 more Qs in order to make up for that 3 seconds, now you're running out of your Blade of the Ruined King movement speed. Now you're running out of time before they can gap close on top of you and get something on you to actually kill you. And all of this talk is just about the late game. This is not even mentioning what happens in the early game, where you're looking at the same 3-second increased cooldown that can absolutely cripple you in some scenarios as you're missing damage and you're missing mobility. Realistically, Ezreal's still gonna have the ability to punish some people in the early game, but in the places where he gets pressured and where he gets ganked and where he overextends, he's going to be far weaker and actually die. This hopefully means that you won't have as much of an irritating time against him because he feels like he's almost untouchable. And that can absolutely be aided by his support, so now let's take a look at the support tier list. If I were to sum up all of the broken and S tier in pretty much a few words, I would say that if you pick a support who scales really well, either in damage or their ability to help and save others, then you're gonna be in a really solid spot right now. Janna and Sona are still the 2 most consistent supports across all of the lower elos and even into the higher ones. They have excellent performance right now, even when compared to some of the other supports who stand out at certain elos. A great comparison to make here is if you look at somebody like Swain, in the very low elos, he does very well, but as you get higher and higher and start creeping up to silver, gold, and platinum, he starts dropping off a cliff really fast. Sona's scaling is almost unmatched, as anytime she manages to get another rank in her ultimate, she gets way better effectiveness thanks to the cooldown reduction increase on her other basic abilities. It's really hard to escape, outvalue, or fight against a Sona who can constantly buff up herself and her teammates, and also disengage really well with her own ultimate. I mean, hey, it's totally valid for you as playing Sona to just walk up and engage the fight with your R even. You can do that if you're actually ahead. And it is easy for Sona to get ahead compared to what it was several months ago. Now, why am I saying all this? Well, that's a good question. And the answer is that the supports who got buffed do actually do well against Janna and Sona. But I don't think it's going to be enough. It's definitely going to be close though. Alistar and Pyke are two supports who are getting buffed on this patch, and they're both moving up into A tier. Janna and Sona are champions who pretty much require you to be able to actively get on top of them in order to punish them. Alistar can have a tough time with this, but if he does it with Flash, it can be extremely punishing and completely snowball the game. Him getting cooldown reductions on his Q, a full 2 seconds at all ranks, is extremely powerful for his fighting and his engaging. This might be enough to disrupt supports and other champions so that they actually aren't as powerful because they cannot freely support people as easily. That, or the alternative, is that the people who they're trying to support get CC'd enough that they simply just die. Particularly in the case of Sona, Alistar is very effective against her, as all he has to do is hit R, yell at her, and then he doesn't care that she just ultied him. Watch out, because this might completely cause the support meta to flip, even though it seems pretty small. Having increased engage and CC potential on somebody like Alistar, who is incredibly strong against supports who seek to enable others rather than disable others, and also Pyke having lower hook cooldowns and a little bit more damage against squishy champions who are very good right now, can be all it takes to flip things around. We might start seeing supports shift to being more totally defensive supports. Who knows, something like Braum or even Tahm Kench might get a lot better if people are just resorting to diving and engaging with stuff like Alistar, or trying to hook and catch people out with things like Pyke. I don't think it's going to happen fast, but this could be the start of a lot of change. With that, we have finally covered all the roles for all of our tier lists on patch 10.14. And to find guides that can help you learn the champions that we've gone over, or just to get better at League in general, make sure you go check out our website, GameLeap.com. We're always uploading stuff there every single day, and everything is done by challenger level players. So it's the best place that you can go in order to learn and improve so that you can win your games. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching the whole video. Make sure that you guys let us know what you think about the tier list in the comments, and of course, I'll be there answering your questions if you have any. And anyways, as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.